and I want to welcome you to this beautiful room and to what promises to be a very exciting event today about the current state and perhaps the future trajectory of the Palestinian terrorist organization, Hamas. Our event today is really an attempt to try to make sense of the war from this summer, that for nearly 2 months, there was a war that was taking place in Gaza. There were obviously heated emotions here in this town and around the world about what transpired during that war, who was right, who was wrong, who was stronger, who was weaker. But in our opinion, the war ended with something of a whimper rather than a bang. That as soon as the war ended, we went back to the other major conflicts that we've been struggling to understand in the region, whether it be the Syria civil war, the rise of ISIS, the Iranian nuclear program, of course, and all of these things have taken center stage, not to mention a small thing that we call the elections here in this town. The question of Hamas and its strategies, its tactics, I think very quickly receded into the background. And so we're here today with perhaps a little bit more perspective to share on the military capabilities of Hamas, the political position of Hamas in Palestinian society as well as regionally within the Muslim Brotherhood camp across the Arab world. We want to take a look at Hamas's finances. And I think perhaps last but not least, we want to take a look at the role of Hamas in the current unrest that has erupted in Jerusalem and has now spread to northern Israel and parts of the West Bank as well. Just as a quick note, for those of you who have not met our Director of Government Affairs, Toby Dershowitz. Toby, please say hi back there. I encourage you to speak with her, especially if you work on the Hill here or in government. And Boris Zilberman, I'm not sure where Boris is. Boris, are you here? Our Deputy Director, but please do say hello. I also encourage you to sign up for our updates, for articles, and to learn about other events. Please talk to any of our staff from FTD here today. And just one final reminder, if you would please turn off your cell phone or set it to stun, just so we can make sure that we have a free-flowing conversation here without interruptions. Now on to our first panel for the day. I want to introduce our panelists here. We will be looking at this during this panel at the question of Hamas's military capabilities as well as the state of its finances. So to my left, I have Jeff White, who is a defense fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He served as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency for 34 years. And I would just add on a personal note, when I first met Jeff, he predicted the insurgency in Iraq well before the war ever began. And I have been impressed with just about everything that he has put out ever since. And so we're very pleased to have him here today. And to his left, we have Dan Mosier. Dan was the Assistant Director at Treasury's Office of Terrorism Finance and Financial Crimes until just a few weeks ago. Dan spent 5 years there. He's now in the private sector, and I can tell you that from the conversations that I've had with him, both in government and out, Dan knows Hamas finance better than just about anyone in this town. So I'm very pleased to have both of them here today. I would just start the conversation by maybe framing our discussion just for a moment. And that is that when we hear about this war that took place this summer, there was a sense that, well, this was inevitable, right? That Hamas and Israel hate each other, and that wars just simply erupt every 2 years. And that's the way that things have been for the last 7 or 8 years, particularly since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force in 2007. I would argue that this war was something very different, that this appeared to me, at any rate, to be an attempt by Hamas to break out of its financial isolation, that since the rise of Mohamed Morsi last summer, that Hamas has been isolated because Egypt has cracked down on more than 1,800 tunnels, making it more difficult to bring in arms, to bring in cash, to bring in goods that can be taxed. All of these things, I think, have hurt Hamas significantly, and it was for that reason that Hamas launched the war that it did this summer and perhaps tried to extract concessions from the Israelis, but more importantly from the Egyptians, and so that this conflict was really not just a military one, it was an economic one as well. This is why we've assembled our two experts here this morning. And Jeff, I'd like to start with you. With the war that we saw this summer, some in Israel have said that Hamas used to be viewed as a tactical threat, as maybe a third-order threat as far as threats go to Israel, and of course there are many. Do you think that this war changed the Israeli calculus in terms of how they viewed Hamas, and if so, why?
Well, I think it certainly had a great deal of impact on Israeli thinking about Hamas and where it was going in terms of its military capabilities. Hamas showed a lot of capability in this war, things it hadn't done before, things that it could do against Israel, and things that would have a significant impact on the Israeli military and civilian population. In a sense, Hamas has become maybe little Hezbollah. It's got many of the same concepts of war fighting, about how to deal with the Israeli military, about how to inflict damage on Israel, about how to survive Israeli military operations. And it was able to effectively implement many of those things during the summer war. It reached, deep into Israel with its long-range rockets. It began, I wouldn't call it saturation rocket attacks on central Israel, but it began to show that it could strike central Israel with significant numbers of rockets. And it did conduct, what you could maybe label saturation rocket fire against southern Israel. It also displayed for the first time, I think, a significant capability to penetrate the border zone, the Israeli defenses, at least right along the Israeli defense line around Gaza, and to cause a lot of disruption, concern, evacuation of settlements and villages, right along the border. In my mind, this adds up to kind of a strategic threat, and one that is likely to grow over time. It doesn't mean that Hamas is going to make real the videos that they put out about showing the conquest of Tel Aviv, by Hamas forces or whatever. I don't think that's going to happen. But it does have the capability to cause strategic level problems, for Israel. And I think it's going to continue to pursue those capabilities.
Jeff, let me ask you for a moment about those tunnels. Without question, the exposure of the tunnel system, I believe there were 32 that were uncovered at the end of the day. There were reports that there was at least a planned synchronized attack through all of these tunnels, and that perhaps they would take place on Israel's high holidays. But certainly there was an indication that these were designed for commando strikes, not unlike a few that we saw Hamas try to carry out. Was it a mistake, in your estimation, that Hamas revealed this capability? In other words, without carrying out a coordinated commando attack, was this a sign that perhaps command and control within Hamas was not on the same page? I mean, why would they let one group through, tipping off the Israelis to the broader problem, and then ultimately bringing on what was essentially a limited ground invasion?
There's a lot of uncertainty about what was the dynamic between the Israeli military and the tunnels. right? There's a lot of argument that the Israelis knew about tunnels. They had many of them identified, were ready to strike. They did, in fact, strike one, right before the war broke out, that more or less precipitated the actual Gaza conflict, or the heavy stages of it. It's clear that Hamas had prepared for war with Israel, and prepared significantly for a war with Israel. It's not clear to me that that this plan or this notion of an offensive against Israel at a particular time was in fact active, and that is, they had not decided on war. They had planned for a war, and they prepared for a war with Israel. During the war, they attempted to use the tunnel system, I think, in a broad way. They conducted at least 6 penetrations of the immediate border, got across, got underneath the border defenses. They engaged the Israelis at least 4 times. They had one, pretty clear success against the IDF at Nahal Oz, which they killed 5 Israeli soldiers that weren't prepared, for the attack. But because of the way the war began, they were not able to activate all of this all at once to achieve kind of a completely synchronous attack through the tunnel system. I think only in one occasion did they actually use 2 tunnels to achieve 2 penetrations, coordinated penetrations of the border defense system. On the other occasions, they were all kind of one-off events, which the Israelis mostly dealt with successfully with their own ground combat forces. And then once the air campaign began, the Israelis began to degrade the tunnel system and degrade the offensive tunnel system. And of course, once the ground campaign began, it became more difficult, yet still more difficult for Hamas to operate.
Talk to us for a minute about the challenges for the IDF in dealing with the tunnel warfare that Hamas carried out, not in terms of the incursions into Israel, but the tunnel warfare that took place in Gaza itself, the way that fighters would reportedly pop up and shoot, the way in which they had the element of surprise on their side. And also, I think from a psychological perspective, I mean, it almost looked as if the Israelis were fighting ghosts much of the time. You rarely ever saw fighters, certainly not in the media, but even the Israelis themselves ceded that they didn't always see who was fighting them. Talk, if you would, a little bit about that.
Sure. Hamas basically had 2 types of tunnels, offense and defensive tunnels. The offensive tunnels are the ones that aim to, cross into Israel and get commando teams through. But they also had a lot of defensive tunnels or combat tunnels, in which they intended to use from the beginning to fight against an Israeli ground incursion. That is, they knew that Israel would be coming in with its mechanized kinds of forces and so on, that they would attempt to penetrate into Gaza. And part of the planned response to that was the defensive tunnel system. When you talk about 32 tunnels existing, you have to multiply that by maybe 3 or 4 times for the number of exits from those tunnels. So you had main tunnels and you had branches off those tunnels, and it was out of these branches that Hamas combat forces, usually small numbers of people, 3, 4, or 5 people, could emerge in the middle of the battlefield in a sense, beyond the perimeter or beyond perimeters that the Israeli ground troops, could establish. So the Israelis found themselves, inside Gaza. Once they launched the ground incursion, they had a front. They had Hamas forces and other Palestinian groups, in a sense, in front of them, but they also had them turning up behind them. And this led to a tactical situation in which Israeli ground units inside Gaza had to kind of defend or be prepared to defend in all directions. And importantly, the defensive tunnels, of course, were well known where they were by Hamas. And Hamas was able to integrate into tunnel operations or activities fire by anti-tank guided missiles, fire by mortars, sniper activity, and so on. So it wasn't, the Israelis weren't just involved in fighting against people popping out of these tunnels. The tunnels were part of an overall system of ground defense that Hamas employed in the area. And another aspect of this is that the Israelis not only discovered tunnels inside Gaza, they had to fight for them. That is that Hamas had prepared to defend the tunnel entrances or the exits from their standpoint. They booby-trapped them. They had ground combat units around the tunnels or inside the tunnels. So when the Israelis, whatever Israeli units were involved, came to destroy a tunnel or were operating against a tunnel, it wasn't just an engineering operation. It was an actual combat operation.
Okay. Dan, let me ask you a few questions about the state of Hamas finance. There was a piece yesterday that appeared in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper of record, saying that ISIS was the #1 financed terrorist organization, the flushest in the world, and that Hamas was #2. In light of the recent isolation from the tunnels, from the sort of campaign by the Egyptians, A, do you agree with that? And B, at this point, where are Hamas's top sources of funding?
Thanks, John. It's a good question. When talking about terrorist groups' budgets, one always has to be careful in comparing them to other terrorist groups. ISIS is flush with liquid cash, usable cash. Hamas is wealthy in a much different way. So I do think they're a particularly wealthy group. I wouldn't order them alongside another sort of military robbing banks kind of operation. But they certainly are very wealthy, and that provides, and they're wealthy in two ways, which is one, they actually do have cash. They have a balance sheet, they have a budget. I wouldn't necessarily rely on their published budget as the truth of the matter, but they certainly have money to spend. But more to the point, they control territory. They control actual resources. They have something of the trappings of a state, and they have property and a general sort of capital wealth that a lot of terrorist groups do not have, and that presents them with certainly with vulnerabilities as well as advantages. So they're certainly very wealthy, but it's in the sense of a pseudo-statelet. And one that's certainly on the decline financially.
Well, we've heard that in the past, obviously, that Iran was the #1 source of funding for Hamas. That before that, it was maybe the broader Muslim Brotherhood movement in Saudi Arabia, but certainly Iran took over as the top financier. And we had the, let's just call it the disagreement over the Syrian civil war, and that led to a breakup in the axis, so to speak. We've heard a lot about Qatari finance. We've heard a lot about Turkish support as well. And then we also continue to hear about this, as you mentioned, this sort of self-generation of revenue. Can you try to break that down a little bit for us? I mean, how do we understand where the top sources are? Can we discern this? What can we learn about Hamas external and internal finance?
Right. Well, and the important part about the external versus internal is their freedom to spend it. I think that's the biggest question. Having patrons for Hamas is a cost in itself, as they decided they wanted to stand on principle and break down relations with Iran over Syria. They have to make those kinds of decisions, and I think that's probably the biggest decision facing them. That they're facing right now, and Qatari support or Turkish support comes with different strings, and they're willing to fund different kinds of things. So I think that's something Hamas is struggling with right now. Obviously, cash available to them, frankly, outside the Gaza Strip is probably the most valuable thing for them. It's the safety blanket that allows them to fund actual imports into Gaza when they're able to get them in, and the weapons and so forth. That all happens outside. They'd love to be generating more internal revenues, but I think that's a place where they've topped out their ability to do so. They were making a pretty strong effort to tax different kinds of products, different kinds of transactions, and actually running into some pretty serious public opinion problems on that. And that's another sort of interesting aspect of Hamas as mini-statelet, that they actually have to worry about these kinds of things in a way that I don't think ISIS particularly concerns itself with a lot of public opinion in the territories that it's rampaging through in the same degree that Hamas really does. And I think they sort of ran out of sort of economic room to generate internal revenue even before the war. And I would say, I would agree with you in your opening statement about why they got into it. I don't know if it was not necessarily a fundraising question for them, but I think it was a question of they were running out of funds, and they suddenly realized that they're either just going to sort of peter out and slowly continue to dwindle, and I think they realized they had to do something with what funds they had remaining.
Well, that actually leads me to my last question for you, and that is that, it was, I think, clear now to most of us that Hamas was in a lot of trouble financially. But I think less clear was the direction of U.S. policy, of Israeli policy on what to do about this. I mean, here you have a terrorist organization that is perhaps standing on its last leg, financially isolated, politically isolated, as the Muslim Brotherhood is flamed out in across the Arab world. There is I think, a fundamental question that has yet to be answered. Do we want to destroy Hamas? I think there may be different answers in different parts of the U.S. government, and certainly I think there would be different answers inside the Israeli government as well. Could you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, and that's an underlying question that I think a lot of times when people talk about Hamas and people talk past each other, it's because we all come with slightly different assumptions about what the end goal actually is. Eradication of the organization, of everyone in Gaza, of none of the above, of purely containing. Do we want to have a Hamas that's funded but controlled? Answering that first order question of what we're trying to end up with colors every tactical discussion of Hamas financing and Hamas counter-financing at every level, and that we really all do struggle with answering that question, because I think if we could snap our fingers and get rid of the organization tomorrow, we would, but then defining the bounds of that organization is a little tricky. We, in the Iran context with U.S. policy, we got into a more or less outright, all-out economic sanctions, warfare aimed at Iran, the territory, everything. We stopped worrying about collateral damage. I don't think we've done that with Hamas. We're not there with Gazans in the same way, and so we have to try to split the baby of Hamas financing, of Gazan financing, and nobody has yet been able to target, only Hamas in Gaza and not the rest of Gaza, for better or for worse. And I think it's a fundamental struggle, and answering those first order policy questions, I think, is critical to addressing them tactically anywhere else.
Yeah, and I would just add that based on the conversations I've had with Israeli officials, that concern is there as well. That the Israelis are not entirely convinced that removing Hamas is in their best interest, despite everything.
Right.
Even despite the fact that they now view Hamas as a more tactical threat or a strategic threat as opposed to a tactical one, there are still questions as to what happens afterwards. Do you have Salafi groups that come in? Do you have ISIS-type groups that come in and fill the void? And so I think these are fundamental issues that have yet to really be wrestled to the ground. I want to move on to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and when we call on you, just please do state your name and your affiliation, and you can direct it to either of our panelists here, and we've got a microphone that will be making the rounds here. So fire away.
If you can stand up and affiliate yourself.
Stand up.
And affiliate.
Hi, Jess Sadik. I'm a Middle East policy consultant. I remember several years ago the pictures of Hamas people coming from Sinai with bags full of cash, and I don't think we've seen that in the last few years. Any idea of that activities continuing under President Sisi?
I think there was significant crackdown. I mean, as John said, but the ultimate crackdown on the tunnels is more of a question of whether or not they can bring goods in bulk via the sort of pseudo black market commercial operators in Gaza. I think it's unlikely that we're ever going to get to a point where we can say with certainty that Gaza is hermetically sealed to bags of cash over the border. It's still the biggest problem for any counter-terrorist financing efforts. Bags of cash are very hard to deal with. They're also a serious pain to transport, and they certainly lose money, and they get arrested sometimes, and and they lose the couriers themselves. So I think it's still very possible that Hamas keeps a couple tunnels or a couple means into Gaza for that purpose. The tunnel shut-off is more of a question of shutting off the commerce that they taxed and relied on and used to fund and resource their operations.
Dan, if I could actually follow up on that, do you think that it is maybe a quiet policy of the Sisi regime to allow for perhaps a couple of tunnels for cash to continue to come in, primarily because the banks are largely shut off to the public? Many of them are not part of the formal financial sector any longer. Would it make sense to do that? I mean, would the Israelis do it? In light of this ambivalence that we talked about in terms of crushing Hamas as opposed to making sure that Gaza society continues to operate?
Again, that's a question. I don't know. I don't have insight into the Sisi government thinking on that, but that certainly would be a reasonable assumption. Israel does not cut off transport of cash into Gaza. You could still walk into, to the extent that you could get into Gaza before the war. You could walk in with as many as 90,000 shekels and not even tell anyone. So there was never an effort to deprive Gaza of cash. In fact, that's again comes down to the fundamental question of, do we want a functioning Gaza and try and muscle Hamas out of that, or do we want to completely deprive Gaza of resources? And I think that question gets answered differently at different times. But I don't think it's a good idea to try to get cash entirely out of Gaza. I think that results in collapse.
Board of Directors of FDD. Thank you. I'm Len Leader. I'm on the Board of Directors of FDD, and it's my understanding that there was a arms shipment trade route from Sudan into Hamas, and I was wondering if you can give us any background on that route, and if it's been effectively closed down, and does the IDF have assurance that weapons are not being shipped in from Sudan into the Gaza?
I don't think they have assurance that there are no weapons going in. The interdiction of weapons and maybe even more importantly, the materials for building weapons inside Gaza is critical to the stability of the ceasefire. It's critical to Hamas's ability to regenerate military capability that was expended during the war. But there's no assurance. There's no, I think, as Dan said, there's no hermetic sealing of Gaza. There always seems to be some stuff going in at some level. There's maybe now an increased emphasis in the Gaza smuggling business on using the sea route, dumping stuff off the coast and letting it float in barrels. That's a problem basically for the Israeli Navy, to some extent for the Egyptian Navy. But the Sudan route was at least important. The Sudan's Sinai route, Gaza route, was very important. It was a main route for important war material, rockets especially, to reach Gaza. It's been described by Israelis that the smuggling system before the war or under Morsi was a freeway, a 4-lane highway with no stoplights on it. So there was a very significant flow of military material, weapons, and the material to build weapons over those routes.
Jeff, if I could ask just a follow-up to Len's question. I think the Israelis have made it pretty clear to the Sudanese how unhappy they are about this route. They've at least allegedly destroyed a warehouse a couple of years back. They've boarded ships that have been en route to Sudan, and we've actually heard that the Sudanese have kicked certain Iranian personnel out of the country, although I think there's still quite a bit remaining. But this raises a question of the indigenous rocket-making capability that Hamas now apparently has, that they may have been able to work around the bottling up of the Sudanese highway, as you described it. If you would just maybe speak for a second about what this new indigenous capability looks like, and is it because of the lack of traffic through the tunnels and through Sudan, or is it something else?
It's partially because of the interdiction of the tunnel smuggling system. But the people in Gaza, Hamas and so on, made a decision pretty early on, as early as 2000, 2001, to produce rockets with Iranian help in how to do it. And they have proceeded more or less systematically to go from very short-range rockets that were hardly more than firecrackers, up to rockets that can reach deep into Israel, Haifa-type rockets, if you want to describe them that way. And they are capable of producing, a fairly decent, rocket, which means it's unguided, right? Missiles are guided, rockets are unguided. And they can produce them in some numbers. And importantly, for Hamas, the cost of doing so is greatly reduced by producing them inside Gaza. I saw a couple of examples of this for one type of rocket, like the Fajr 5 would cost, or a similar version of it would cost Hamas about $5,000 to produce inside Gaza, but $15,000 to smuggle in. And so there was a significant economy in building things inside the country. The problem for Hamas in doing that is they have the technical know-how, they have the experience, and so on. But the question is, where do they get the materials to do it? And this gets into the issue of pipes, tubing, the materials for building or making explosives, and so on. So a lot of that stuff cannot be produced inside the Gaza Strip. And I think importantly for the next conflict, which there almost certainly will be, so Hamas is going to try to make significant improvements in its rockets. More effective warheads, longer range, more accuracy, and all of those things are going to depend on its access to materials.
And actually, one other question for you, Dan. Sudan never really gets talked about anymore as an enabler of Hamas finance. I mean, but if one looks at the designation of Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism every year, the relationship with Hamas is always cited. The relationship with Iran in terms of facilitation of weapons is always cited. Could you talk a little bit about the effort, if there is one at this point, to isolate Sudan further? I mean, the problem I think is, at least as I understand it, is they're already a basket case financially, so there's not much of in the way of tools or levers available to the United States. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, it's not a question of can we warn off their financial sector, which is how normally the U.S. government would handle that sort of thing. It's primarily, as you say, a facilitation hub, not an actual source of funds, again, because Sudan doesn't have that kind of cash to throw around. So the question is one more of physical interdiction and not the sort of typical tools of counter-terrorist financing.
Any other questions from the audience? Got a question back there?
I'd just like to hear about the rebuilding process and who will manage the money that the international community is going to be providing to the Gaza Strip to rebuild all of the destruction that took place.
It's a great question, and I'm happy to have left government before it needs actual answering. This is the struggle, and this is the struggle I was talking about in answering the fundamental questions about what we're doing with respect to Gaza and Hamas. We're rebuilding, a city, and they will undoubtedly take some credit for that rebuilding. It's one of the things I used to advocate for when I was in government, that it wasn't actually Hamas's access to funds most often that they benefited from. The funds themselves, they don't benefit from. They benefit from the ribbon cutting. And so it's keeping them away from the ribbon cutting events of these infrastructure projects, keeping them from being able to take credit with the people. That's the spending that's going on there that's the risk, not really diversion into their secret slush funds. I'm sure some of that will happen, but that's I think the lesser threat. The real threat is how do we get their stamp off it? And in order to get their stamp off it, you have to have somebody else there to really claim it and champion it. And that's where people start to get cold feet. They're like, well, we don't want to give it to the Palestinian Authority, or we don't want to give it to UNRWA, or we don't trust them. Well, you need to have an alternative. If you're going to spend money in Gaza, there needs to be some alternative that needs to be the champion of the international community when they give them funds. And I would certainly argue that the banks in Gaza are the best place to control funds that go in and out of Gaza, because they have the most knowledge of what goes on there and the most to lose if it goes wrong.
Are the banks in Gaza to be trusted? I mean, again, they're operating under Hamas rules.
They're operating under extreme hostility, but they do. The interesting thing about the financial sector is that they do have their own power base. This is true in Lebanon. It's true in a lot of places where we think of the terrorist territorial control to be absolute. Hamas doesn't want the banks to leave Gaza. And the banks hold that threat over Hamas, that they'll pack up and go. And I think that they do maintain the ability to act not entirely independently of Hamas, but contrary to Hamas's interests when it is in their own interest of survival. And I think banks have learned that it behooves them not to be caught, in any way funding Hamas.
One of the things that we heard after the war was that it wasn't so much the cash that mattered, but it was actually the kinds of goods that would come in. Specifically, the cement. Obviously, the cement was crucial for the creation of those commando tunnels. Jeff, did you have any sense of how long those tunnels took to make, whether this was done through cement that was built locally or whether it was brought in from the outside? Could you give us a little bit of insight into what ultimately became a crucial military mission that was based off of humanitarian donations?
Well, there's quite a bit of evidence. I think evidence that the Israelis acquired in the course of their counter-tunneling operations that cement for humanitarian purposes was in fact used in the tunnels. These are very elaborate. In many cases, structures lined with electric power, phone lines, and so on. There was, plenty of evidence that there was diversion of cement, for this purpose, and not only for tunnels, but also for other Hamas, military purposes. And basically, Hamas hardened its infrastructure against Israeli air attack. This is something that learned from the conflicts in 2009 and 2012, that the way to survive Israel's expected aerial onslaught was to dig and then to, encase everything they could, in concrete. So there was, I think, widespread diversion of these kinds of things for military purposes. And it's a huge issue now, is how to prevent that from happening in the rebuilding period.
We're going to take one more question here before we wrap up.
This question is addressed to Jeff as a follow-up to your comment just now. The question is, are the Israelis using bunker busters or other type weapons in order to counter the use of cement and concrete in hardening the Hamas infrastructure? And how big are those bunker busters? Certainly they're not the equivalent of the American mobs.
They have some up to like 5,000-pound warheads. I think some of those were used during the recent conflict against particular targets, tunnel entrances, other kinds of structures, and so on. The problem for the Israelis, though, is how do you work the relationship between large, heavy weapons and civilian casualties. So in many cases, the Israelis preferred smaller warheads, smaller weapons to very large ones, even though they might have known that a larger warhead would achieve more damage, more blast effect, whatever. So, Gaza is just not a place where you can throw around blockbusters, without causing, collateral kinds of damage. So there's a limit. That I think is, that's different, right? That would be a situation in which they would have, very particular targets, very high importance targets, probably limited collateral damage targets, and I think they would feel freer to use heavier weapons in that kind of a situation, as would we.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of this panel. I want to thank our panelists, Dan Mosier and Jeff White. Please, a round of applause for them.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Toby Dershowitz, Vice President for Government Relations at FDD, and I'm so pleased to be here with such a very, very distinguished audience. We have many folks from the Hill, obviously. We have many folks from embassies around town, folks from the State Department, others from the policymaking community. Thanks for coming today and welcome. You have Congressman Pompeo's bio and Congressman Brad Sherman's bio in front of you. And as we wait for the congressman to come, I will simply just add the following. Each of our distinguished panelists have played a really critical role from each of their respective vantage points. Congressman Pompeo from the House Intelligence Committee and Congressman Sherman from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So thank you in advance for your remarks today and also for your incredible and important work on these issues. I want to jump right into questions. My colleague John Schanzer mentioned a little earlier that there was, in the last 48 hours, a report that said that Hamas was the second wealthiest terrorist organization right behind ISIS. Now, there was a discussion earlier today about what that meant. Regardless of how we measured that, I just want to ask you, kind of zooming out, how did Hamas get to be such a wealthy organization? Is it that we don't have sufficient eyes on Hamas? Zooming out, and then we'll zoom in on some of the specifics a little bit later. Is it that we don't have enough eyes on it or leverage? Big picture, what would you say?
So first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's a great group. It's a great opportunity for us to have a real conversation about a very serious threat to us here in America. And your question has to do with financing. If you back up, my sense is that we have sufficient eyes, but not sufficient heart. That is, we have not been prepared under a couple of administrations now, frankly, to do all that we needed to do to resource constrain a designated terrorist organization. And they have friends in lots of different places. They change over time. The relative funding sources change over time as well. That is to say, there have been points where Iran has had fewer resources because of what it's doing in other places. It's diverted resources elsewhere. The Turks and the Qataris have stepped up. But it is absolutely fair to say, whether they're number 2 or number 4, it's a little bit like the college football poll on any given week. One never knows, and there's much disagreement. But suffice it to say, Hamas leadership, as opposed to their own economic development, which is very challenging, their leadership has plenty of resources to continue to spread the terrorist fight to the places that they want to take it.
Sufficient eyes, but not sufficient heart. That's tweetable. And
that's the first time I've ever done that, so there you go.
And quite insightful. Let's zoom in a little bit to some of the countries that you mentioned, Qatar, Turkey. Both Qatar and Turkey are obviously key funders, supporters of Hamas politically as well. Talk a little bit about how we manage the relationship. On the one hand, they're a key funder of not only Hamas, but other terrorist organizations. On the other hand, Qatar houses a very important air base, U.S. air base. How should the U.S. engage Qatar on this issue?
So as with so many things in this part of the world, there are lots of moving parts. It is difficult to isolate the discussion about Qatari funding of Hamas without looking at the bigger challenges. And when you step back from this threat that America and the Israelis face coming out of the Gaza Strip, you do have to take this holistic approach, right? You have to think about what's going on in the bigger world. You can't talk about it without talking about Egypt and what they're doing along that 8-mile stretch of border. You can't do it without talking about what's going on in Turkey and the complexity connected and the relationships between Erdogan and Hamas that we all know about and been going on for so long. And when you turn to Qatar, we know that they have been providing resources to folks who have killed Americans, folks who are doing real threat to us in the Middle East, and including funding folks inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas. They provide resources to America at our bases. There are places that they have helped. Frankly, I'm sure some of the folks who were with Treasury talked to you about this. There has been progress in getting them to think about the right way to think about. So that's 2 steps of thinking. Think about the right way to approach the threat from ISIS in Western Iraq and in Syria, and who ought to be funded, who ought to receive arms and arms shipments, and who shouldn't. But Qatar has proved to be incredibly difficult. In spite of what the vice president said was a gaffe, he was describing reality. He was describing a very real situation where the Qataris have not done enough to make sure that their resources, money that's coming out of the country, doesn't end up in the hands of folks who are trying to wreak devastation and very much acting in a way that's inconsistent with American policy, stated American policy.
Tell me if you think it's too soon to make judgment calls about the new power structure in Qatar, the new emir. Has there been a change in their approach to funding terrorist organizations like Hamas, or would you say it's too soon to tell? Do we think that the father still controls the purse strings? What are your thoughts?
So I think it's too early to tell exactly how that all ends up. I don't think the father is completely out of the picture. Mine's not. I have my own voting card. I make all my decisions. My dad is a very liberal man, and each day I get a little note from him back suggesting an alternative method of thinking about the way the world works. And so I suspect in these places, right, it is the same. You have structural change.
Control your finances?
Yeah, and he doesn't control my finances, not today, at least. He's eligible for Medicare. I guess I control his. Look, you have structural, just like any business, just like any organization. You have structural, you have an org chart, you have a line chart, and then you have the reality of the personalities on the ground and the impact that they can continue. Hello, Brad. How are you, sir? Nice to see you. Good to see you. And so I do think
talking about Qatar, just to fill you in.
I do think it's too early to tell about how the current emir will behave. I hope that we can convince him and those around him that we have shared interests in his region, and we can begin to act more in concert than we have been able to achieve over the past years.
If I can just chime in, I think Qatar believes that it is kind of immune to American pressure because, and that we would have to support their government because they host a military base. I would point out that the U.S. government does not stand behind the Castro regime, although we do have a military base in Cuba.
So picking right up on that, what should we do? Should we use our U.S. base either as leverage? Is it time for us to take a look at How much is it costing us to have a base in Qatar, and what would it take to move it?
I think the base is the base, and Qatar is Qatar, and the two are separate. I think Guantanamo is useful to the United States, whether or not, and our policy there is a naval policy. Our policy toward the Castro regime is something else.
I want to pivot a little bit to Turkey. Congressman Sherman, you have focused a lot on Hamas financing, being financed by Turkey, including an event that took place a couple of years ago, which was the Mavi Marmara, the flotilla, and the organization that funded the flotilla, which is a Hamas-related organization that I would admit, which is called the IHH. I would note that while Treasury Department has done a lot with regard to going after Hamas finances over the years, it has expressed concern about the IHH, but it has not designated the IHH. How important do you think it is to look into organizations like the IHH, and also whether or not Americans contribute to organizations like that?
Well, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Those organizations say Hamas is a terrorist organization. The Gaza flotilla was in aid of Hamas. They showed up, they had a ceremony, they turned over valuable assets to the Hamas regime. We're told that, well, this may have been a violation of U.S. law, but what could be more humanitarian? These were just civilian assets. Concrete, for example, was on that flotilla. And what could they do with concrete except build schools? Events of more recent origin indicate that turning concrete over and building materials over to Hamas is an act in furtherance of terrorism. I called Eric Holder at the time and urged the prosecution of those U.S. citizens, the investigation and review of possible prosecution of U.S. citizens engaged in that aid of Hamas. It was a clear violation in my mind of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. Needless to say, the Justice Department did not pursue an investigation of that. And I think it comes from a view that if you violate the law but you think you're doing a good thing, then maybe you won't get prosecuted.
Sticking for a moment on Turkey, Congressman Pompeo, do you have anything to add about how we should address countries like Turkey? On the one hand, they also are obviously a NATO ally and an important U.S. ally. On the other hand, they've engaged in significant terror finance issues. We refer to them as frenemies. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit about what you think Congress's role should be when it comes to Turkey?
You know, I'd add to what Representative Sherman said only in this way. It is almost always the case that we are dealing with nations in the Middle East where we have shared interests, but we don't have perfect alignment. And so it presents complexity in American policy, but we should never be unclear about what the mission is. And I think that's the challenge that I heard. I returned from Turkey, I guess it's been 3.5 weeks ago. What I heard there was incredible frustration with an absence of understanding what the administration's real objectives are. So we asked them to do a handful of things, some of which they're doing better today than they were doing 4 or 5 months ago, including the work they're doing trying to stop terrorist flow. They're making a little bit of progress, but they're not clear what our objectives is. And I had to share with them that I'm not either. And this is the challenge that we present. So we go ask them to do things that are difficult for them politically internally, but we don't provide the clarity and the support so they know they can rely on America as they begin to take these difficult actions. And so whether this flotilla or whatever it is that we're talking about, America is not performing its core task in the international world, which is setting out demarche, setting out a path, saying these are the things that we are expecting from you, whether it's a NATO ally in Turkey or the Qataris or any other Gulf states. If we would set out a clear set of things, these are the things we want you to do in exchange, this is what America will do, we will find that they will behave in a manner that is much more consistent with what we hope to get from them.
I want to pivot a little bit to Egypt. Egypt was a very interesting case. Egypt and Hamas had a strong relationship via Hamas's sort of a mentor, the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Sisi regime has pivoted from that. Talk a little bit about how important Egypt's pivot has been vis-a-vis Hamas. How important is that? Why did they do that? Lessons to be learned from that.
So I think I mentioned this earlier. Egypt is an absolutely central partner in all of the challenges we face in the Middle East today. There's places that we're going to be disappointed in the human rights things, some of the things that we wish they would do differently, but make no mistake about it, they are prepared to engage in the counterterrorism fight in a way that will assist us in achieving America's objectives in important ways. I was there, it's been a bit ago, and a very senior Egyptian official was as frustrated as you can possibly imagine from America. We were refusing to send them helicopters. And I understand they've now been released, they're on a boat, they're supposed to arrive in November, but for months, Egypt was prepared to destroy tunnels of terrorists, jihadists in the Sinai along that 8-mile strip. 8 miles, think about 8 miles. It's a very short boundary. It's from where we're sitting today to downtown Arlington, Virginia. That is the stretch where this border, and Egypt is prepared to go help America and Israel destroy the take on the counterterrorism threat. And America refused to send them the resources to do it. Egypt wanted them, the Israelis wanted them to have it. Egypt will be at the center of the solution. You saw they were part of the negotiated solution that ended overstates what we achieved, but brought to this moment where we are with respect to Israel and Gaza. And they will be at the center of this in the years ahead. America needs to make sure we support Egypt when it's acting in America's best interest.
I think Egypt pivoted one way and then the other over whether Mubarak would be able to install his son. Mubarak lost power in that effort, and yet now the same forces that kept Mubarak in power are back in power in Cairo. The foreign policy of so many nations is driven by domestic policy. The hatred of the Brotherhood by those who currently run Egypt is overwhelming, and I think that's a tremendous useful sentiment when it comes to Hamas, the Brotherhood organization in Gaza. The United States also has an ideology where you have an ideology in favor of democracy. The Brotherhood is not a democratic organization. It did win one democratic election due to unusual circumstances, and U.S. law required that the president do a few things to protest of the lack of adherence to democratic normalcy by those who overthrew the Brotherhood regime. But I think now that we've seen elections in Egypt, et cetera, that relations should be much better, or one step better.
You know, I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't mention the Hamas relationship to Iran. Not because today Iran is such an important financial backer of Hamas. It's not. It's not as critical in terms of Hamas's finances as it once was, but it still does have a relationship. And I want to ask you, and I should say that Iran in recent months has pledged to rearm Hamas and further destabilize the region. We are in the midst of negotiations with Iran on a different subject, on the nuclear file. Should Iran's support of Hamas play any role whatsoever in the negotiations between the United States, the P5, and Iran? Either one of you.
I would think you'd want to keep these things separate, because I don't want to see us making any concession that brings Iran even a day closer to a nuclear weapon, whether it be for the release of political prisoners and Americans in Iran, whether it be for a promise of forbearance when it comes to arming Hamas, whether it be a promise for forbearance when it comes to international terrorism. I don't think you give an inch, I don't think you give them one centrifuge in return for any concession, real or imaginary, on any issue.
And just to quickly follow up, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this too. What does it say about Iran as a credible partner if it continues to arm Hamas and engage in other problematic activity? Does it have an impact? Should it
I
have
would
an
just
impact?
say most countries even some of our friends are not terribly trustworthy. Our enemies are less trustworthy. I think you can't say you can't negotiate with Iran because they're untrustworthy. Most of the important negotiations in the world take place with untrustworthy regimes. And any deal that comes out of Geneva that relies on trust or the belief in trust or anything other than the most excruciating verification, anyone who looks into Rouhani's eyes and soul and comes away with the belief that they're dealing with a trustworthy leader and therefore we can forgo one bit of verification is fooling themselves. And I don't think it's trust but verify. I just think it's verify and verify.
You know, I would agree, but I'd go one step further. I'm not convinced that there's a verification regime sufficient in the world to create any confidence that Iran, this regime in Tehran, won't continue to work to develop nuclear weaponry. They may slow down, they may move facilities around, they may play games for a while, they may pretend to be part of the westernized but this regime is intent on creating hegemony in the Middle East. This is what you see with Hamas. You see it in Damascus, you see it in Beirut, you see it in Baghdad. And so the idea that we can create a verification regime sufficient to change the leadership's mind in Iran not to build a nuclear weapon, I think is a fool's errand. You need to look no further than what happened in Sarak, where for 10 years we missed a facility being built in Syria, a nuclear weapons facility being built in Syria, to know that in spite of the intelligence community's best efforts, both ours and our allies' intelligence, our liaison services, these are difficult tasks. And so as this administration continues to write letters describing us as making sure to protect Iranian interests, I think we're entering into a very, very dangerous place for the United States of America.
I just want to comment that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. We would all want to see the end of this Iranian regime. We all fantasize that everyone in Iran, or the vast majority, agree with us. We could eliminate the Iranian regime, would be enter into a war greater than Vietnam, perhaps less than our commitment in World War II. There is no appetite among the American people for incurring the tens of thousands of casualties that would be necessary to invade and destroy this regime. That is the only mechanism that would ensure that there isn't a regime in Tehran bent on getting nuclear weapons just as quickly as they can do so below or above the table without facing unbearable economic costs. So the question is not will any deal in Geneva or any other policy completely eliminate the risk of a vicious nuclearly armed regime in Tehran. The question is, what are the available options given the willingness of the American people to incur economic and even worse military casualties in the pursuit of foreign policy? So I agree, we're going to see a bad regime in Tehran, and verification means at best 99.9% verification. And we're going to be living in a dangerous world.
I'd only add this. I made no suggestion that the 82nd Airborne ought to find itself on the outskirts of Tehran any time in the near future. I only suggest to you this: the economic sanctions were working. They're putting enormous pressure on the Iranian regime. As oil prices continue to fall, that continues. And to the extent we remove sanctions that have been in place and passed in large numbers in the United States Congress, we enhance the capacity of the Iranian regime to continue to wreak havoc throughout the Middle East.
Last question. The U.S. has funded the PA, Palestinians. This summer we saw that perhaps some of that money was used to build this very labyrinthine set of underground tunnels that obviously is very problematic. The U.S. is poised, has committed to giving several $100 million toward aid to Gaza. Are each of you comfortable that there is sufficient oversight and proper channels such that this aid will not once again be used to engage in those sorts of activities, but will be really truly used to help the Palestinians who are in need of it?
No.
Yeah, a second that.
But let me go a little bit beyond the no. Look, Palestinians living in Gaza live tough lives. The pictures are there for all of us to see. And the natural inclination of the American people is to want to help. However, if you actually look at the statistics, life expectancy and other measures of human success are greater in Gaza than they are in most of Turkey, let alone in sub-Saharan Africa. We have a limited amount of American aid to help the poorest of the poor in the world. The people of Gaza are not the poorest of the poor. And so you have a chance to help the poorest of the poor, knowing that not $1 is going to go for terrorism when you help the people of Liberia, or you have a chance to help those who are struggling, do suffer, but are not as suffering as those in Western Africa.
So what's the solution? How do we guarantee that is appropriated properly?
There is no perfect solution. I'm not sure the best use of our foreign aid is Gaza. And obviously, as long as the unity government is a fig leaf and Hamas runs Gaza, then there is a high probability that foreign aid to Gaza is not one of the best uses of our foreign aid dollars.
So will you stipulate any conditions on U.S. aid to UNRWA?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can do that. I do want to, I think Brad and I agree here in large measure. So this morning I read unclassified sources that Hamas is saying if you don't begin reconstruction quickly, there'll be, I summarize, hell to pay in Israel. All the more reason not to provide resources to them, right? This cycle of we launch missiles into your country, you come back and retaliate, there's damage to our economy, you must therefore pay for that damage, as a cycle that we have to break. And that cycle isn't broken by providing aid while Hamas is still in control in Gaza. And there have been lots of problems with UNRWA, some of our own making, some frankly just the nature of the complex relationships that are anytime there's foreign aid provided. But America could do a lot better in making sure that any of the aid that we provide to them gets to the right places. And it is my judgment we ought to withhold it until we're confident that that money is going to the right places and through the right channels.
Brad, would you withhold U.S. contributions to UNRWA, or would you stipulate that it was used in particular?
Presently, even the administration is holding up the aid because they recognize that it is a Hamas government, not a unity government that's running Gaza. So I can't imagine that I would be more in favor of aid to Gaza than the administration.
And I promised we'd get just a couple of sentences from you, Congressman Pompeo, on your recent trip to the region. What are you hearing from friends in the region about Hamas, about its future, and also about the U.S. approach to Hamas?
You know, it's a topic that didn't come up. I traveled to Riyadh and to Amman and to Beirut and into a couple of places in Turkey. It's a topic that doesn't come up standalone very often. It comes up in the context of the larger challenges within the region. There's three things. Most of those folks want to make sure that our policy there isn't strictly related to the destruction of ISIS, but want to make sure that the administration's stated policy with respect to the Assad regime is carried out, or at least the beginnings of that. That is to say, they're very disappointed so far that the pressure we've put on Assad has amounted to exactly zero. I commiserated with them. And then the second thing is they really do want to understand what America's objectives are. They are deeply distrustful. The president's statement that he was going to launch missiles into Syria and then his decision not to do so has created a distrust that remains deeply embedded in their memories. It's now, 15 months ago, and they have not forgotten that we have made commitments to them once that we refused to honor. And so they're deeply skeptical of the administration's stated positions, and they're hopeful that we'll have a much more forceful approach there.
Yeah, one comment I'd make, because I'm over on the Senate side, I'm a House member, and so I can only imagine the questions that will be asked of the next Attorney General. But I hope one of them is whether or not we would see a criminal investigation of those who provide aid to Hamas, whether that aid be cash, whether it be concrete, whether it be by people who in their heart hope that the money is used only to build schools, or whether the people actually want the aid used to build tunnels. Whatever their thought processes and motivations are, the law is the law, and it ought to apply to liberals and conservatives equally.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's next for Hamas, its place in the region, its place in the unity government, and what we could expect in any future conflicts. So next to me I have Sam Tadros, who is the senior fellow at the Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom, where he focuses on Egyptian politics, Islamist movements, and religious minorities. We have Jonathan Schanzer, who is FDD's Vice President for Research and formerly a terrorism finance analyst at Treasury. And at the end, we have Matt Levitt, who is the director of the Washington Institute's Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, and previously served at Treasury and as an FBI counterterrorism analyst. And I'm Rosie, and I work for BuzzFeed, and I'm going to moderate. So I thought I'd start with you, Sam, and talk a little bit about Egypt. If you could just get into a little bit about Egyptian attitudes toward Hamas now, post-Protective Edge, and how they're changing.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I think we have to put the current Egyptian attitude towards Hamas into the context of what has been going on in Egypt internally in the past few years. The Egyptian revolution in 2011, has been an event that unleashed great changes in the country. A president went from the palace to prison, another from prison to the palace and back to prison. Naturally, this has meant a lot of changes in people's attitudes, things that they have not been used to in the past 30 years of pretty much nothing happening in the country. Their view of Hamas has similarly changed. While Hamas was viewed as part of the resistance towards Israel, as a legitimate actor against Israeli actions against the Palestinians, this began to change as Hamas's relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood became a focus of people's attention. Similarly, the attacks on Egyptian prisons during the revolution has meant that, which led to Hamas operatives escaping from the country, has led to numerous accusations of Hamas interference in internal Egyptian affairs. The result has been greater skepticism towards the movement and the role it plays, especially with this changing attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood inside Egypt. This has meant criticism of Hamas, which we saw very clearly during the last conflict taking place in Gaza. Egyptians were not enthusiastic about getting Hamas out of the corner it had put itself into. The attitude in Cairo, both, I might say, in the official government positions and in the general attitude in the street, was very antagonistic towards the movement, to say the least.
Right. So can you get a little bit more into what that functionally is going to mean for Hamas?
Well, for Hamas, let me use the latest, or by now not the latest, but the recent attack on the 24th of October in the Sinai as an entry point to this. The attack has left, it was a major attack, 30 or so Egyptian soldiers died in it. The immediate reaction in Cairo has been to, number one, close the borders with Gaza, indefinitely, I might say. Number two, to notify Hamas that there will be no negotiations, the truce negotiations, permanent truce or so, that were supposed to take place in Cairo 3 days later, were completely delayed. Also, there has been this Egyptian effort to end the tunnels once and for all by creating this buffer zone between Egypt and Gaza. This has meant, of course, the deportations of unknown large number of Egyptians living on the border, estimates from 3,000 to 10,000 people, and serious measures by the Egyptian government to completely seal off that border. The rationale in Egypt ranges from directly blaming Hamas for the attack, claiming that it took part in it, to lesser extent people claiming that the tunnels aid the terrorists in their actions against the Egyptian soldiers, or that Hamas provides aid in some form or shape to those groups in the Sinai. Hamas, of course, has rushed to condemn those attacks. It recognizes that any attack taking place in the Sinai against the Egyptian army means lesser support for it inside Egypt. And we have to understand that for Hamas, the Egyptian public opinion is probably its one remaining weapon to influence the actions of the Egyptian government. So it's very important for Hamas that this attitude towards it in the Egyptian public changes. We've seen Musa Abu Marzouk, for example, the Hamas leader, announcing that we have severed our ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. The tunnels are a thing of the past. They're not there anymore. We're handing over smugglers to the Egyptian authorities. We're cooperating with them. These are all attempts by Hamas to ensure that it does not have a completely sealed border with Cairo.
Mm-hmm. John, you kind of look like you've got that I want to say something look on your face.
Yeah, I was going to say it's always the way. No, I would just add that what Egypt has done, arguably, with regard to Hamas over this last year, I would say has probably hurt Hamas more than anything that Israel and the United States have done combined since Hamas was founded in 1987. That includes the wars, that includes the strikes and everything else. That it was always that there was at least an out for Hamas in the Gaza Strip, particularly since it took over in 2007, that there was a way that they would at least be able to look to another country for a lifeline. I think that lifeline was inflated even further after Mohammed Morsi came to power. One Israeli official called Cairo the back office of Hamas. During that year, there were significant amounts of cash and goods and weapons and everything was flowing through there, and this was kind of the heyday for Hamas, and that all came crashing down with Sisi. And maybe one last point is that Sisi's not doing this because he wants to impress us here in the United States. In fact, I mean, I think that the relations have been rather poor. He's not doing it because he wants to celebrate Hanukkah with Israel. He's doing this because he thinks that this is in the Egyptian national interest. And so this looks, at least for now, to be a very permanent thing. I mean, as long as Sisi's in power, and that's significant.
Well, Matt, do you agree with John that this looks like sort of a permanent shift, or do you think that it's sort of going to shift back eventually?
I think this is going to stay here for a while. When I was in the region a few weeks ago, people were saying to me on both sides of that border that the Israelis will never hate Hamas as much as the current Egyptian government does. And they also stressed, in line with what Jonathan just said, that there was a time when if they wanted to talk to each other, they'd come to us first and ask us to arrange a meeting, and then they'd sit another side of us, and there'd be a trilateral meeting. And the bad news is that they don't come to us for the meeting, and we're a little bit on the outs in terms of some of our relationships in the region right now. The good news is that the Israelis and the Egyptians have a very close relationship, especially on security across that border, and they're working very, very closely together. And that's important because as we look forward to what Hamas is going to be doing in the coming months and years, I think greater cooperation is going to be all that much more important. I think a lot of people are looking at Hamas against the ropes, and they are, and saying, okay, mission accomplished, and I think that that's premature.
Mm-hmm. So to switch gears slightly, I wanted to get you guys talking a little bit about the future of Hamas leadership all over the place. So Turkey, Qatar, and Gaza. So John, do you want to start? I mean, how do you see, what's sort of the center of gravity geographically right now for Hamas leadership?
Sure. It's a great question, Rosie, and I think the answer is there is no center of gravity for Hamas, and this is a significant change for the organization. Everybody knows that Hamas had its external base in Damascus for many years, and that crumbled after the Syrian civil war began, that Hamas could simply not look on as Sunni Muslims and Palestinians, in fact, were being slaughtered in the streets. And so you had this divorce between the Iranian axis, the Syrians, and Hamas. Hamas went looking elsewhere for assistance. What they did is they found significantly more assistance in Qatar. They'd always had a good relationship, but sort of more of a doubling down, if you will. And the Qataris came to the aid of Hamas, pledged $400 million, kind of made a big deal about supporting this Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. Some of the more surprising moves, I think, have come out of Turkey. Turkey, to me, represents a very new change in a government that is part of the NATO alliance, which should be troubling, but also just the center of gravity is shifting in terms of activity in the West Bank. It appears to be directed out of Turkey now. Salah Arori is one of the figures that we're watching right now. He is the founder of the Qassam brigades in the West Bank. He took credit for the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens in June from the West Bank. He took credit for it in Istanbul in front of a large Islamist conference where the deputy prime minister of Turkey was in attendance. I mean, there's no shame, in other words, in terms of this relationship. They're very open about it. And actually, one of the more interesting things that we've just learned, and I think this could be the first time that we've announced that, I don't know where we've seen it anywhere else, but Imad al-Alami, who is the traditional envoy to Iran, is now in Turkey as well. And I don't know what this means in terms of the trajectory of Turkey as a center for Hamas activity, but it is very troubling because this is the man who has traditionally brokered a lot of the arms deals, the cash transfers, and certainly works with the Iranians on military affairs. Apart from these two, we've also seen some significant moving around. You mentioned Sam Musa Abu Marzouk, who's been based in Egypt. As I understand it, he's actually just had his citizenship revoked, and that does raise questions about where he'll go next. If you were watching CNN this summer, Osama Hamdan was another figure who's based in Lebanon. In other words, what we're seeing is a scattering of Hamas throughout the region. This will make it that much more difficult to understand how leadership decisions are made. And just to maybe a final point here is that there are, in fact, 4 competing forces, I would say, within Hamas right now, and I don't know who's winning. You know, there's the Politburo, the political folks that are based in Qatar, and then there's the military wing, the Qassam brigades, which are primarily based in the Gaza Strip, but also the West Bank. And then the West Bank and the Gaza Strip themselves, plus all these external activities. No one knows exactly where the center of gravity is any longer. It will make it much more difficult for the Israelis to negotiate with Hamas. It will make it much more difficult for us to analyze how Hamas will make its decisions moving forward. All of this, I think, is extremely significant.
Either Sam or Matt, do one of you guys want to jump in on this?
Yeah. I'd just say there are lots of ways to slice the Snicker bar. Another way to look at the divisions within the Hamas leadership is between the different sub-Shura councils, which are traditionally the external leadership, leadership in the West Bank, leadership in the Gaza Strip, and leadership in the Israeli prisons. And I think we're going to see leadership in the Israeli prisons, which ironically tend to have a little bit more space because they're in the prisons, no one's cracking down on them. In that sense, they tend to be allowed to have communications, I presume, so that the Israelis can eavesdrop on them. But they traditionally get more powerful when there's crackdowns on the ground. We're also going to see, I think, that at least a dozen important individuals, including Imad al-Alami, but not only, and of course Salah al-Aruri. By the way, there are 2 people traditionally in this town who have cared at all about Salah al-Aruri. We're both in this panel. Follow that name, Salah al-Aruri. We're going to see that continue. The fact that they've been spread out is nothing new. Osama Hamdan was in Lebanon for years, and Imad al-Alami, before he was in Tehran, was in elsewhere, and they've had people in Sudan and people in Qatar, etc. I think you're going to see those people in Turkey because they have no one cracking down on them, and the people in the prisons being particularly important. And there are a small number of, especially Mazloum Fukaha and others in the Gaza Strip, who, in tandem with Saleh al-Aruri in Turkey, are funneling money and overseeing operations in the West Bank. And I think what we're going to see in particular is continued efforts to try and pick up the pace of things in the West Bank. What you're seeing even in Jerusalem right now is Hamas trying to inspire people to do things. They want there to be operations, they want there to be pressure, and because there's no prospects right now for real movement, unfortunately, on any type of interim or other peace process, that's going to give them opportunities to light some fires and create some tension.
Mm-hmm. In terms of what's going on in Israel right now, I mean, do you think that, what are we seeing here with this sort of quasi-explosion of violence? I mean, what does this mean for Hamas?
I think it's, just to comment on one thing from
sure.
the last discussion, I think the Turkish angle is very interesting, not only with Hamas. Turkey is becoming the Mecca of Islamism at the moment. This is true of Brotherhood operatives. I think there are about at least a couple of thousand Brotherhood activists from all ranks of the organization and from other Islamist organizations in Egypt that are based in Turkey at the moment. A couple of the big names left Qatar after a Qatari decision to expel them or to ask them to leave nicely and went to Turkey. But beyond these, there are, again, thousands of young activist Brotherhood guys that are based in Turkey at the moment. It's also from Turkey that many of the Brotherhood-affiliated TV channels are being broadcast towards Egypt, inciting violence, calling for Egyptians to rise against this Sisi regime. So it appears that the Turkish decision is much more beyond even Hamas, but the decision to become the clearest leader of the Islamist movement throughout the Arab and Muslim world. On the developments going on in Israel, I think as an outsider who's not focused on what happens particularly in the West Bank, I think it's an interesting development, to say the least, that this periodic nature of the violence, the less organized, the less developed in terms of weapons, both stabbing, the attacks via the cars, it's making it much dangerous environment for Israelis at the moment, and shows, of course, this question that was raised in the previous panel of, do we really want to end Hamas completely and allow both a chaotic scene in terms of terrorist attacks on Israel, prefer a much more organized way that we deal with after, I mean, every couple of years throwing a couple of rockets on them and having this escalation in Gaza?
Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to take audience questions now. So I'll start with you.
Now it's working. The situation of the Israeli Arabs, it seems that that's a fairly unique development as opposed to riots Intifada from West Bank or even East Jerusalem. And this may call into question some assumptions that have been made in the past about Israeli Arabs.
Maybe I'll start. I had a piece last week in Foreign Policy that tries to address some of this. I think that to a certain extent what we're seeing right now is rather unique. That first of all, that Jerusalem would be the epicenter of some of this unrest. Arguably, we haven't seen anything like this since the 1929 Western Wall disturbances. That traditionally the Jerusalem Arabs, as we call them, have had a vested interest in the kind of flourishing of the Israeli economy, that they benefit significantly from the tourists that come into Jerusalem, particularly into the Old City, and that polls have showed that they don't want to become part of a future Palestinian state, and that they don't want to take part in Palestinian politics. Many of them did not vote in the 2006 elections. And so the fact that we're seeing this right now is significant. I would say that the epicenter right now looks like it's in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Shuafat. That this was where, if everybody recalls from this summer, this was where that young man, Muhammad Abu Khadir, was killed. I actually was there with a colleague of mine, Grant Rumley. I don't know if there he is. We went to visit Shuafat in the summer as the funeral procession was taking place, and we saw a significant amount of flags from all the various factions, but not any one in particular. But more importantly, what we began to see was the Shuafat residents were throwing rocks, throwing Molotov cocktails, and burned down the light rail that connected Shuafat to some of the West Jerusalem neighborhoods, and in fact allowed for the Shuafat residents to go to work. This has not actually died down throughout the summer and through the fall, that we've seen Shuafat erupt repeatedly, as well as some of the other neighborhoods. And so there is obviously significant concern about what this means about coexistence moving forward. But I would say this, that I don't believe that it is being driven by Hamas in any way. I think Hamas would love to take advantage of this, and they're trying to. I mean, they're trying to egg on the populations right now, but this is something that is happening in Jerusalem and actually now to a certain extent in the Triangle, in the Arab areas in northern Israel. It's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are taking the lead from these populations. So it's a very different thing right now that raises a lot of concerns for those within the Israeli security apparatus.
I just add that from time to time this does happen. And it's an opportunity for groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad to find people who have blue ID cards and can travel more freely and are in areas that aren't completely under Palestinian or Israeli security control. Some of this, the vast majority of this, is not driven by Hamas or Islamic Jihad. But if you look at most of the vehicular attacks, you find individuals who are tied to either Hamas or Islamic Jihad, former members of this and the brother of a senior Hamas leader there, somewhere else. And I think you are seeing an effort by Salah Haruri and the others, it's not just one person, to encourage that things happen by us or other people tied to us in their perception where they can happen. And so their problem is that Hamas's life right now is being controlled by not one, Israel, but three entities: the Israelis, the Egyptians, and the Palestinian Authority. And even under a national unity government, the Palestinian Authority continues to crack down on Hamas in the West Bank in a very serious way, and to say no to every request that Hamas has in the Gaza Strip. And so Hamas is trying to demonstrate its continued relevance. And so you see plots against Fatah officials in Gaza, which Abu Mazen has now blamed on Hamas. And you see the plot in October, the attack in October in Sinai, which the Egyptians have tied to Hamas. And you see the after not only kidnappings, but plots that followed, including 90 individuals arrested in the West Bank, and reportedly a shadow government, Hamas shadow government, that was planned to be created in the West Bank, and potentially even a plot against Abu Mazen himself, as he told some of his Gulf benefactors. And so Hamas is trying to show, yeah, we understand we're in financial straits, we're diplomatically isolated, but you can't ignore us, and we're not going anywhere, and we have all kinds of leverage that we can use against you too, violence if nothing else, and they're trying to demonstrate that they can't be ignored. Even at a time when, if you look at protective edge of the conflict this summer, pretty much everyone ignored them. It was a weird time for them to initiate something, because in comparison to what's going on in Syria and Iraq, this is just not important. Of course it's important, but compared to everything else that's going on, you didn't have Gulf states, you didn't have huge numbers of Arabs and Muslims around the world getting excited the way they might have in other circumstances, because compared to what else is happening in the region, this was not as significant. So Hamas feels the need to maintain relevance, and to do that it's going to inspire all the way to sponsor and carry out attacks when and where it can. And if the easiest place to do that for a variety of security reasons is in East Jerusalem, and if the easiest way to do that is to inspire people, they'll do that too.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to jump in? Or? Oh. All right. You.
So what is the current state of play? You touched on it a little bit, but can you give us a little insight into the current state of play between Hamas and Fatah, and what is the likely path that will take, and what are the implications to Israel and, you know, Jordan and the region and so forth?
Look, first of all, I think it's important to note that the unity government that was forged back in the spring was not an indication that all of a sudden all was well between Hamas and Fatah. It was an indication that Hamas was in dire straits, that they were isolated politically and economically and needed to find a lifeline. And so the one way to make sure that providing assistance to the Gaza Strip would be all of a sudden halal would be to put the Palestinian Authority at the helm. This would make everything okay in the eyes of the donor community. And this is essentially why Hamas elected to forge this unity government. Abbas was only too happy to oblige, primarily because, look, he still looks at the Gaza Strip as something that he lost in 2007. This was on his watch. This was during his tenure. And so he would like to be able to reclaim this in some way. The unity government fell apart and the war to a certain extent erupted because of financial transfers that were supposed to take place through Arab Bank. And if anybody has been following Arab Bank, it's been in the news because of a court case where the bank was found guilty for transferring Hamas funds. Arab Bank was put on notice by the U.S. Treasury that it was not to transfer the $60 million that was going to pay Hamas salaries. It's at that point that things began to unravel. Now, throughout the summer, we continued to hear that Hamas was on the rise and that Abu Mazen was kind of kicked to the curb in terms of the attention and in terms of the leadership on the world stage of the Palestinian cause. I think we've now seen that that was a bit premature, that Abu Mazen is now seen as the answer to a problem that could not be solved by war. And so now he's been brought out again as the man who can at least make the donations to the Gaza Strip legitimate, that he can provide a certain legitimacy writ large to the Strip and to try to perhaps tame Hamas in some way. I think based on everything that we've seen, this is a very functional relationship, or maybe it's actually dysfunctional, is probably a better way of putting it. I mean, they've agreed to have this arrangement, but they cannot agree on anything else. They're fighting about everything. I mean, in terms of attacks against one another, they're fighting about exactly how aid would flow through the Gaza Strip. They're still fighting about who represents the leadership of the Palestinian cause. This is not something that's going to go away. And I would just kind of more broadly assert that we do ourselves a disservice when we ignore Palestinian politics. That this conflict is hugely consequential to ultimately finding a way forward with either a two-state solution or just even finding a way to live without bombs going off every 2 years. But that conflict is still alive and well, and it will create an impediment to much of whatever we would like to accomplish in the region.
I'd just add that there never was a national unity government. And there still is one on paper, but there never was one. Hamas never gave up control of security institutions, made clear it would never do so. It never sent home the social service workers, the civil service workers that it hired in parallel to the civil service workers who had already existed when they took over the Gaza Strip in 2007 and who were continuing to get their salaries while they stayed home from work from the government in the West Bank. All of the critical issues about what would happen under the national unity government were not settled. And the only thing they settled was we'll have one. So Ismail Haniyeh no longer calls himself the prime minister. He's the deputy secretary general of Hamas, but he's made it very, very, very clear he's not going to relinquish any power. The only reason the national unity government continues on paper, even only on paper, is because of the need for these salaries to be paid, which Hamas can't pay on its own. And now, because Hamas initiated and suffered, well, the people of Gaza suffered during the war this summer, for Reconstruction money to come in. And the international community, including the Europeans, in a way the Europeans were not as attuned to this in the past, are very, very attuned for the need for there to be clear oversight at the border, at construction sites, etc., and that none of this can be in the control of Hamas. So Hamas has no choice but to play along with this, even as they continue to found new popular militias, new popular armies. None of these are under the control of Fatah. So you have an extraordinarily, I would completely agree with Jonathan, dysfunctional reality here. And in the Gaza Strip, if you were to ask who is in control, it's not an answerable question right now. In terms of who's technically under control, you could say, who's more under control on the ground, you can say, but who you go to as an international community, that's more complicated.
You back there.
Matt McGinnis from American Enterprise Institute. Wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about next steps between Iran and Hamas. I mean, what the calculations each has for the other, given the aftermath of this summer?
I would say that there are certain channels that are still open between Iran and Hamas and some that are still closed. The political leadership in general is having a very hard time reconciling with Iran. As long as this Syrian civil war continues, it will be extremely difficult for all of these political figures, Khalid Meshal, Saleh Haruri, Osama Hamdan, all these characters that we see making public statements on behalf of Hamas, they're having a very, very difficult time reconciling. They're still trying to, and we understand that there's discussions underway, and they're perhaps trying to find a way that they can continue to work together, but Iran is demanding a certain amount of allegiance, and they're simply not going to get it from a Palestinian organization that represents Palestinians and Sunnis. It's very, very difficult for them to reconcile. That said, during the war, we still saw a significant amount of interaction between the Iranians and particularly the Qassam brigades, the so-called armed wing. Now, Matt here will be the first to tell you that there really is no distinction within Hamas, in terms of its political activity and its armed activity, I would say, except for, and I'd be curious to see whether you agree, Matt, except for when you're actually when you're getting arms deliveries. At that point, it is the military people who are going to be receiving it. They're still receiving all sorts of assistance from the political wing, but they are the ones who are going to be in receipt of the weapons, and then they have a certain deal that they're going to make with Iran in terms of how they're going to use those weapons, how they're going to deploy them. And so what we saw this summer was at least what appeared to be assistance by Iran, perhaps even North Korea, in terms of the tunnel building. On top of that, an indigenous rocket-making capability that Iran certainly has helped provide Hamas, not to mention the longer-range rockets, the Fajr 5s, the M75s, the J-80s, all of these rockets that were hitting deep into Israel's heartland as well as to Israel's north. These were either provided by Iran or they were built indigenously with Iranian assistance. And then there were also the questions about the commando tactics, that when Hamas fighters came through these tunnels, where did they get the training to do this? The amphibious assault that took place, how did they learn to do that? The attempt at a hang gliding a strike. All of these things appear to have come from Iran. It seems to indicate that there is still a relationship, although a modified one. It's not support from Iran to every aspect of Hamas, but very specifically to the military commanders.
Well, just to jump in, I mean, what exactly does that look like? Are there like Iranian military trainers in Gaza right now helping them do stuff, or are there Palestinians going to Iran to be trained there?
There are, first we know that there are at least some Iranian officials that are based in Hamas or travel in and out. And Sam, I don't know if you've heard this, but I've heard from several Egyptian friends that you have a lot of people that, the tunnels that we talked about, where you have personnel leaving Gaza and their goal is to get to the airport in Cairo and to be able to fly to Tehran to be able to get that kind of assistance. It's gotten a lot more difficult over the last year now that Sisi is in power, but certainly there is a continued attempt to do that because Iran is so pivotal with regard to training.
Yeah. Also, you don't need to have had this training yesterday. So some of the training that led to activities that we recently saw happened several years ago. Certainly the Grad rockets and the technology for the Makadmas and the Jabaris, that's from several years ago, and that they were building up over time. Now, John, you're absolutely right. My whole book on Hamas was basically arguing that the idea of making a distinction between the wings of Hamas is ludicrous. But you're right, there are instances where one wing does things on its own. I'm talking about the overall functioning of the organization. And it's not just for receipt of weapons, but for example, it's quite clear that just this summer, during the recent conflict, it was the Qassam brigades that basically overrided the political leadership and said, you can't get what we all want through your means, we're going to use ours. And there has been a steady rise in the influence and the power of the harder line actual militants within the organization. This doesn't make Ismail Haniyeh a puppy dog, but it does mean that there are tensions within any organization, as we see, in democracies, and I'm sure it's not the case within an FDD, but everywhere else in the world, there are tensions within an organization, and we're seeing this. We're seeing this there too. The fact that the events going on in the region are so deeply sectarian makes things more complicated for having a real relationship the way they used to with Iran. But Iran is extraordinarily practical, and Iran will quietly swallow its pride. And while it won't necessarily have, state visits and close ties with the political leadership, it will allow its secret militant people to have meetings with other secret militant people to achieve the shared interest of sticking it, in this case, to the Israelis. And they'll do that even if things aren't, hunky-dory in terms of the relationship, because ultimately, Iran has interests. One of those interests is making Israel uncomfortable. And if Hamas can do that, so be it. At the end of the day, for some of these lesser proxy groups, in which I put it basically everything other than Hezbollah, the relationship comes down to pay for performance. So if you are performing, the pay will come. In some ways, the tension in the relationship predates the Syria catastrophe, because you had Hamas in power since 2007, effectively not so much, taking the jihad to Israel on a regular basis like they used to. And so there are already some tensions there, and you started seeing Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups getting more of those weapons.
If I can add, I think there is obviously a civil war going on in the Arab Muslim Middle East between Shias and Sunnis, but it's not the only conflict that is going on. A similarly important one is the civil war going on within Sunni Islam between the Brotherhood Turkey-Qatar axis and between the Saudi-Egyptian UAE one. The fact that those two civil wars are going on at the same time means that it allows movement for actors in between. So while the Sunni Shiite conflict prohibits Hamas's relationship with Iran, or not prohibits, makes it much harder for Hamas publicly to have an alliance with Iran, the other conflict going on, which is equally important within the Sunni Islamic world, allows shifting alliances over specific issues. And it's the room created by the intersection of those two conflicts that I think allows this movement to go on.
Okay, who else? You over there?
Ask for some Palestine. What's the relationship between Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad? How do the two groups differ? And do you think PIJ is gaining more popularity among the people of Gaza? And are they closer to the Egyptian government?
Yes, yes, no, no. Look, there's obvious, there's common cause, there's common ideology, and yet they fight a lot too. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has always been closer to Iran. You've even had cases within Palestinian Islamic Jihad of individuals, Palestinians, who have converted to Shiism, which within the Palestinian society is very, very rare. And as tensions have popped up recently, as we've discussed with Hamas, some more of the weapons have been sent in to Islamic Jihad. Even when Hamas was in control of all the tunnels, but this was the deal. Yes, you'll be receiving the goods because you control the tunnels, but here's how much has to go to others. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group, a militant group. Hamas is a movement, which includes militant and terrorist and lots of other things. I remember at one point when you could count, Islamic Jihad had 5 charitable associations to it in the West Bank and Gaza Strip combined. I don't know what the numbers are today. But that makes them much, much smaller, much, much harder line. They will do things even when Hamas won't, but they have to toe the line because Hamas will crack down from time to time. The relationship, therefore, has been tense, as it has been between Hamas and all the militant groups over the past few years, when, depending on how Hamas felt, they would support you carrying out an attack, a rocket attack or something against Israel. They would stop you from doing. Hamas at one point, wrap your head around this, Hamas at one point had an anti-rocket battalion that would patrol the borders to stop people from firing rockets at Israel, not because they didn't want rockets to fire at Israel, they just didn't want rockets to fire at Israel at times when they didn't want rockets to fire at Israel. So all in their terms. So Palestinian Islamic Jihad is in some ways more dangerous because it's got fewer constraints, in some ways less so because it's much, much smaller. Hamas threatens Fatah for dominance within Palestinian society. Islamic Jihad does not.
Do you want to jump in on the Egyptian angle a little bit?
Oh, I'd agree. I mean, the Egyptian government does not view Islamic Jihad as a partner in any way or as a replacement to Hamas. Their official and unofficial position has been that only the Palestinian Authority is the one representative of the Palestinian people, and that Egypt would not accept any alternative to that.
Who else out there?
You can use the microphone.
You want to wait for the mic? Yeah.
Thank you. From the Embassy of Israel. I'm familiar very much about the differences from the ideology point of view between Hamas and ISIS. But based on what you said and the people on the last panel, what they said, do you think that in the future, from different kind of reasons, Hamas will be part of ISIS?
No. Oh, you want an explanation? No. These are very, very different groups. Hamas is that strange amalgam of jihadi Islamist ideology and nationalism. ISIS is the exact opposite. For ISIS, there is no nationalism of any kind other than the Ummah. So I just don't see this happening at all. Hamas has spent lots of time, continues to spend lots of time, combating far more radical Sunni jihadists within the Gaza Strip, including those who have come up with the ISIS banners and that type of stuff. You don't see any effort for them to try and go that route. What you do see, which we have seen for several years now, especially, as I said, once Hamas stopped doing all jihad all the time because it had to deal with the responsibilities of governance, you saw then, and you will continue to see, Hamas operatives who want to do more jihad and are frustrated that Hamas is not doing as much jihad, defecting and going to, first it was Jaljalat and a whole host of other organizations, and you'll continue seeing that. We've already seen a few dozen people from the Gaza Strip, and then much smaller numbers from the West Bank, and some Israeli Arabs leave to go fight in Syria, and some with Jabhat al-Nusra and some with ISIS. And that avenue of departure still exists. There's a decent number of Palestinians fighting there, and you'll see that, but I don't see the movement as such going that route.
You know, I would just jump in and say this, that first of all, and I think Matt indicated this already, when Hamas cracks down on jihadists, I always sort of chuckle at, what's the charge? It's awkward timing. It's certainly not, that they don't want attacks against Israel. And so I think that it's not as if Hamas is in complete disagreement with some of these Salafi movements that have sprouted up within the Gaza Strip. It's really more about trying to maintain a monopoly on the use of violence and to ensure that Hamas's attacks are the ones that are official and the other ones are not. But that kind of leads me to maybe another point, which is we've already talked about the differences that exist within Hamas and how it is an organization where there is no center of gravity. And that would indicate that we have a very difficult leadership structure. We don't understand exactly who's driving that leadership. I can tell you that it is traditionally the Gaza-based cadres that are kind of a fulcrum within the movement, that it's the fighters there on the ground that will ultimately determine, obviously, where the war will go. The thing that I'm concerned about, and I would say I agree with Matt mostly that this is not something that is likely to happen, but I am concerned about the fact that there will be returnees from Syria. They will be returning to the Gaza Strip. they will have a compelling narrative. They will be very zealous in their worldview about spreading kind of the ISIS idea. And so I would say that there is cause for concern for splinter groups that could have been once part of Hamas and going off in a new direction. Don't forget that Hamas itself is a splinter group from the Muslim Brotherhood. They decided that the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't violent enough back in 1987 and created a new violent movement that looked more like Al-Qaeda than it did like the Brotherhood. Now you could see something similar to this again. We haven't seen real indications that this is happening, but it's something to keep an eye on.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to leave it there, but if you guys will join me in thanking our panel.